Chapter 121, Choices. 121 Choices. 1600 PS's bonus. His choice of one kind for me was even more straightforward. If he was going to go all in, then why not go all in? If he focused his beast taming on snakes and serpent creatures alone, he would gain an intimate understanding of them and even gain their beast totem. Maybe, that beast totem would synergize well with his madness and even accelerate his comprehension speed. Finally, there was Taboo Bond. It was the one that filled him with the most trepidation, but it was also because of that he felt he had to choose it. Setting aside how well it synergized with both other paths, how it could allow him to both intimately understand the snake species and improve them. Silas also had motives outside of this as well. The power to manipulate and control genes. It made him wonder, wasn't this similar to what gene crystals could do? And if he could incorporate them into himself, would it be possible to skip over the necessity of a gene crystal and directly create his own unique genes? Every time he ran into a stat limit or a gene limit, it felt like was running headfirst into a steel wall. No matter how he thought about it, he felt that there would eventually come a day where he'd run into one he could just push past. The Slithering Madness dungeon was a glitch in this system's matrix, and yet it only provided him with one common gene crystal. How difficult would they be to find? Separately, these paths were perfect for him. Or rather, they were perfect for the Silas that had already stepped onto the path of madness. There was simply no going back. But together, they were even stronger. Were for the Invincible could allow him to bolster his stats by fusing with his beasts, one kind for me would allow him to intimately understand these beasts, likely to the point he wouldn't lack familiarity with their gene talents or skills, and finally Taboo Bond would allow him to directly improve his beasts to further strengthen the stat boosts he would receive, while one kind for me would give him the perfect path to doing so. Together, they stacked perfectly and Silas felt that for his situation, there was simply no better combination. So he chose them. Paths less than were for the Invincible greater than, less than one kind for me greater than and less than Taboo Bone greater than have been chosen. Profession initializing. Profession title sequence paused. Please choose a kind. Silas nodded to himself. A kind was broken up into several categories, but they were mostly divided into narrower versus broader categories. An extremely broad category might be mammals, or reptiles, or even birds, would fall into that category as well. A middle ground would be something like canines, or large cats, or even dinosaurs. The narrowest categories were mostly highly specific and included singular species with no variation between them. Something like serpent, or arachnid, or even beetle, would be considered a new middle ground between the original middle ground and the narrowest categories, and they were actually a sweet spot. The more restrictive your kind was, the stronger your beast totem and the clearer the information and links you would receive would be. But, obviously, if your chosen kind was too restrictive, then having all the information in the world would be worthless. This is why Silas didn't hesitate to choose serpent. Or, rather, their official genus. Serpentis. Silas felt a ripple when his choice was made. Goosebumps rose all along his skin and for a moment he thought he had grown scales, only to look down and find that he had overthought it. Profession formed. Congratulations, you have become a Vipermancer. Name, Silas Grimblade. Species, human, F. Affiliation, Grimblade lineage. Profession, Vipermancer, FFF+. Level, 0. Open profession window. Yes, no. Yes. Profession, Vipermancer, FFF+. Level, 1. Paths. Were for the Invincible, LV1, one kind for me, LV1, Taboo Bond, LV1, contracts. 1. Basilisk King, LV5. The screen looked simple at first, but Silas quickly realized there were a wide range of hidden menus within. Basilisk King. Status, heavily injured, mentally fragile. Loyalty, 1/10. Skills. Greater than King's Bind. Greater than King's Shift. Greater than King's Shield. Gene talents. Greater than King's Gaze, dormant. Silas didn't bother to look at the Basilisk King's stats. He had already seen him once before. It was unnecessary to him. However, he did take stock of its dormant gene talent before moving on to the next screens. This is. Were for the Invincible. Level, 1. Experience, 0 100ths. Path talent, fuse LV1. Fuse, path talent. Greater than fuse with your contract and gain less than 50% greater than of their stats, greater than fuse with less than 1 greater than contract at a time. Greater than fusion process takes less than 5 minutes, greater than to complete, greater than fusion lasts less than 30 seconds, greater than. Fusion current impossible. Check beast status, path quests available. Greater than raise loyalty to 210 experience, greater than groom your contract, 10 experience. Greater than raise your constitution to 123, 50 experience, greater than raise Basilisk King's dexterity to 100, 100 experience. Greater than rekindle Basilisk King's pride, 1000 experience. Silas fell into some thought after a moment. The path quests were all perfectly laid out for him, and his assumption was that the higher level the path was overall, the stronger the related path talents would be. What was interesting to him was that there seemed to be some overlap between the path quests of his 3 paths. Did that mean he could only cache them in once? Or was this a hidden benefit of synergistic paths? Maybe due to their synergy, he could level them up all at the same time. One kind for me. Level 1. Experience 0 100ths. Path talent, Beast Totem LV1, Insight LV1, Beast Totem, Path talent. Greater than suppress less than F rank, greater than Serpentis beasts by less than 20%, greater than. Greater than forms hibernation realm where recovery increases by less than 100%, greater than increase fusion speed by less than 50%, greater than buff contracts by less than 20%, greater than. Insight path talent. Greater than observe gene sequence of contract. Greater than sense evolution triggers. Greater than comprehend contract. Path quests available. Greater than groom your contract, 10 experience. Greater than place contract in hibernation realm, 10 experience. Greater than document contract gene sequence, 250 experience. Greater than rekindle Basilisk King's pride, 1000 experience. Greater than find an evolution trigger, 1000 experience. Chapter 122, Deterrence. 1800 PS's bonus. Comprehend, Sila's eyes narrowed. Did this mean that he could read the Basilisk King's thoughts? But wasn't it an unintelligent creature? Or was it the case that, due to ether, these beasts had already evolved beyond that point? He turned toward the Basilisk King, who had remained curled up in a ball all this while. He realized that even in the darkness of the night, he could practically feel the Basilisk King's presence. Silas didn't hear words when he moved his intention toward using insight. Rather, he felt waves of emotions as though he were feeling them for himself. Fear, anxiety, hunger. Those were the 3 biggest ones, but there was another that was the undercurrent of them all. It was much more complex and harder to summarize in a single word, but Silas felt that it was. Embarrassment. I see, so it can't talk, but I can anthropomorphize it. After feeling around for a bit longer, Silas felt that he had gotten the hang of it. He called up the Basilisk King's gene sequence and almost immediately shut it close. Ellipsis single quote. His mind was blank. He truly didn't know what to think for a moment. He hadn't known what he really expected, but he thought that it would be something simpler, at the very least. Until now, genes were all so straightforward and simple. You killed a beast and you plucked him out. But it was only now he realized just what the madness key had meant by the fact that the system simplified things, because in the one case it didn't, his mind was almost overloaded. And he also understood why the system had called it by a term he had yet to see until now. The gene sequence was almost blindingly literal. Just now, he had seen a spiraling staircase of DNA, strung out into what felt like infinity. Sila's doctorate had heavily relied on mRNA, so he was quite familiar with how complex these matters got. But breaking down a sequence based on somewhat known scientific methods, with the help of computers to process large amounts of data, was one matter. But this was an entirely different ballgame. What was he supposed to do? Read it. How could you even begin to analyze a string of data this large? Silas shook his head. After he got past the overload of information, he didn't panic. In fact, he was quite certain that he would be able to find a solution. This system was so impossibly beyond anything mankind had ever created. Wouldn't they have methods far beyond what he had grown used to? In that case, with these paths in hand, and some background knowledge to rely on, what did he have to fear? Taboo Bond. Level 1. Experience 0-200. Path Talent, Extricate LV1. Extricate Path Talent. Greater than Extricate, less than F rank, fragmented, greater than Genes. Path Quests available. Greater than Document Contract Gene Sequence, 250 experience. Greater than Find an Evolution Trigger, 1000 experience. Greater than Modify Hibernation Realm into Laboratory, 10,000 experience. 200 experience instead of just 100 is needed to level up. And there's only one path talent with oddly vague parameters compared to the others. And what's this about the Hibernation Realm? The Hibernation Realm was mentioned as an ability of the Beast Totem. He could use it as a place to not only store his contracted beasts, but it would accelerate their healing. He didn't know what creating a laboratory entails, neither did the quest elaborate. But he assumed that if it was easy, it wouldn't be worth 10,000 experience. Silas closed his eyes and took a breath. He would allow this matter to marinate in his thoughts for a while longer. He would rest for now, then make his way back to Castlemaine. He didn't know what the end of the trial would entail, but he was looking forward to seeing his family again. After a night of rest in the Hibernation Realm, the Basilisk King's status had gone from heavily to moderately injured. Silas didn't actually think that this was because of the Hibernation Realm alone, but rather because of the insane constitution of the Basilisk King. In another day or two, it should be back up to full health. Silas still took it out, though, for two reasons. First, he wanted the Basilisk King to drag Brant. He had realized that strength didn't have a direct role on speed, but the higher your strength was in relation to your speed, the more speed you could maintain while carrying a heavy object. The Basilisk King only had 45 speed, but its 110 strength was so far superior that it could maintain its peak even with Brant on its back. The second reason Silas had brought it out was deterrence. He realized that the entire time he spent reading about his new Vipermancer profession, they hadn't been attacked by beasts even a single time. At first, he thought it was the defensive perimeter. But last night, while the Basilisk King was in the Hibernation Realm, he suffered 2 attacks. He felt that it couldn't be a coincidence, and as expected, the journey was smooth sailing. He had to slow down considerably to allow the Basilisk to keep up, both because it was still injured and his own speed had hit 100 after absorbing the genes of the woman the Basilisk King had killed. That wasn't all he had gained from them. Coins, 7294F. This was the total he had gathered from the 2 women in addition to what he forcibly took from Brant. Although he was keeping the latter alive, that didn't mean he wouldn't take his things. He was still having thoughts of the Bronze Nexus voucher he had. If he wanted to maximize it, he definitely needed more coins. After all, he could only use it once. Silas had underestimated just how much time he wasted fighting and avoiding beasts. He took 3 days to make it to this location originally, but even with him limiting his speed to the same level he had been before forming basic Etherflow, he could already see familiar territory around him after just a single day. Chapter 123, Grumlock. 2000 PS's bonus. It seemed that this new Vipermancer profession was giving him both obvious and hidden benefits. I should rest for the night. He felt good, extremely good. He assumed that it was both because of his increased mental and constitution. He definitely needed less sleep now than he did in the past. But he was still mindful of the Madness Key's warning. If he could afford it, he should take a rest when he could. Silas frowned. He felt his mood shift oddly just now. It was something that he would ignore usually, but ever since he had comprehended madness, he was hypersensitive to his own mood changes. What was that? No, what's this uneasy feeling? Silas was about to rest, but something told him not to. He frowned, but ultimately listened to it. He was at most 2 or 3 hours from Castlemaine. Casting a glance at the basilisk, he frowned. It was fatigued because of its injuries and it was far too slow. Follow after me using our connection. Protect this one. Don't let him escape. Silas gave it simple commands. The loyalty of the beast was low, but a contract of subservience was a contract of subservience. Loyalty was a measure of what kind of commands the beast would follow and how far they would be willing to go without a command. So long as the command was reasonable and didn't extend too far, even a beast with one loyalty would listen. After he finished speaking, Scylla's foot pressed so hard into the ground the soft soil sunk 3 inches before he exploded forth. Ellipsis. Scylla heard the sounds of battle long before he saw them. In the depths of the night, unless he kept his night vision skill active indefinitely, it was impossible to see a far distance. However, it wasn't long before his eyes spotted it. It was the only light source, one light by the torches of Castlemaine and bolstered by the ether pulsing into the skies. The first thing spotted were the trolls. They were far too large, standing at 2.5 meters tall on average. Their figures were large and bulky, their shoulders as wide as carriages. They looked like walking, club-zinging trucks. There were just 3 of them, but the carnage beneath them was unsavory. Scylla spotted the corpses of rotten wolves strewn around them and he immediately understood that the situation was bad. If not, it was impossible that Kasari would have gone so far. Grumlock FFF+. Level 5. Physical 137. Greater than Strength 183. Greater than Constitution 247. Greater than Dexterity 52. Greater than Speed 67. Mental 2. Greater than Intelligence 0. Greater than Wisdom 5. Greater than Charisma 0. Will 151. Scylla couldn't believe his eyes. All 3 had stats just as ridiculous. And yet, they weren't alone. There was a group of what looked like under a dozen humans who were attacking what looked like a Castlemaine defensive shield vigorously with the backing of the trolls. How did this happen? Where did humanoids with such outrageous strength come from? And why are they working with humans? Scylla's green irises flashed in the night as his gaze landed on a person. Racksmith FFF+. Level 5. Nothing else showed up. However, Rack immediately turned to meet Scylla's gaze, his own irises flashing as well. When he realized he couldn't scan Scylla's, his expression became frighteningly serious. You 3, go deal with him. If you can't capture him, don't hesitate to kill. Alexia Brooks FF+. Level 4. Jackson Abri FF+. Level 4. Natalie Parker FFF. Level 4. Scylla's heartbeat fell into a steady rhythm, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. He didn't believe in the metaphysical, and he especially didn't like things that he couldn't explain. He had felt an odd feeling, and it led him here. It was irrational and made little sense, but he had followed it and ended up in this situation. How was that possible? His status window appeared and blended into the world, augmenting his reality. Then, his gaze landed on his luck stat. It felt like the only explanation. Premonitions. It was faint, and without madness he wouldn't have even registered it. But he was certain that it was there. Madness. Scylla took a step forward and in that moment, it seemed as though his foot rippled color out into the world. The vague, illusory feelings seemed to solidify until the world was projected into his mind. Alexia knocked 3 arrows into their bow the instant they closed the distance to just 20 meters. Natalie and Jackson continued rushing forward as she took a light jump into the air, releasing her 3 arrows at once. Her jump seemed to allow her to glide. She kept moving up under a force that was beyond her actual leaping strength and she didn't stop until she was just barely 5 meters high in the air. Then her arrows descended, one flying true and the remaining to curving in the opposite direction. The latter 2 weaved through the shallow line of trees Scylla was standing within. Jackson brandished a sword while Natalie had yet to take out any weapons. Or so it seemed. Scylla felt like he could see through it all. His visualization had never been so clear before. The night might as well have been bathed in the sun's rays. Just when the arrows were about to hit Scylla, a green glow grabbed a hold of them. 1 layer, then 2. They froze in the air, unable to move even a single step forward any longer. By now, with madness buff, Scylla's telekinesis could output a physical of 121. When he cast it out twice, whatever momentum the arrows had once had was snuffed out like a waning flame on a cold day. Scylla took another step forward, and the arrows reversed, flying back with so much speed that Jackson couldn't even react before his head was pierced right through. Natalie arched her back, becoming almost akin to a contortionist. Her head almost hit the ground and she barely stopped herself with a palm, but it was useless. Chapter 124, Barrier. Etherflow. Momentum shift. The arrow that had just been flying straight abruptly took an inexplicably sharp 90-degree turn downward, finding Natalie's forehead before she could even take out the weapon she had been so carefully hiding. Scylla's only activated etherflow for a brief instant, and yet the arrows shattered into shards. Natalie's head blew into pieces, but Alexia had been further away. The explosion hit her like a solid wave of air. As though a sledgehammer had rocked her, she flew backward, falling onto the grass with a heavy thud. Silas finally stepped out of the clearing of trees and into the marshy lands. His green irises glowed beneath the cool night air as he suddenly accelerated, his 100 speed on full display as he closed the distance. He almost seemed to fly, closing the distance on Alexia before she could even gather herself from the ground. A distance that had been less than 20 meters to begin with felt like a matter of 4 or 5 steps for him. These people had equipment that was likely beyond most of what he had seen until now. He couldn't give them any quarter. Bang! His fist shattered her skull, forcing her body to rebound against the ground. Blood splattered and flew under Rack's shocked gaze. Natalie was one of his elites. His entire team, in general, was among the cream of the crop. What Silas hadn't realized just yet was that the FTO-FFF+ ratings given to beasts and humanoids alike were, much like stats, relative. It measured how good you were in relation to all humans. It was a ranking that would shift every day if you happened to fall behind or improve. And Flight Natalie placed her in at least the 90th percentile of humans. But she was killed in an instant. Unless Rack set his trolls on her, it was impossible for him to do the same. Who was this man? Silas didn't give Rack the time to figure it out. In his clear vision, he could see the subtle lines of ether connecting Rack and the trolls. He had already come to understand that this man was the mastermind of everything. So long as he killed him, everything would be over. The mentals of these trolls were so poor that there were any number of ways to defeat them without his direction. Seeing how fast Silas was closing the speed, Rack frowned. Leave the barrier to the trolls. Everyone together, Rack ordered just as Silas' fists began to glow. Bang, bang, bang. Just when it seemed that Silas would have to close the distance to deal with them, 3 heads caved in, their noses deforming and their frontal skulls collapsing beneath the pressure. Rack's pupils constricted. What the hell kind of attack was that? It didn't even have to travel through the air. It looked like it just appeared before their heads. How were they even supposed to dodge? Activate your defenses. Now. Do not use any archery against him. Watch out for projectiles. Rack slapped against his chest as he spoke, his leather armor thrumming to life. He secretly sent a command to one of his trolls at the same time. He estimated that Silla's output strength was around 100. With the troll's constitution, there was no getting by that. They just had to watch out for any weapons or treasures he might have. A silvery blue light of ether coated their bodies and their constitutions were multiplied several times over. Silas took silent note of this as a swordsman closed the distance on him. Close combat will be dangerous, but if I keep playing it safe, they will suffocate me. The only way to deal with the unknown variables is to press them all down so quickly they don't have a chance to retaliate at all. Ellipsis. Within Castlemaine. Kasari was scrambling. They had managed to withstand this siege for 2 days already, but there was only so long her barrier would last. They were chewing through theirs funds like there was no tomorrow, and there still wasn't a simple way to defeat them all. Until she saw that system message. She had never sighed such a breath of relief in her life. Now, it wasn't like they had to withstand an indefinite siege. They just had to last for 4 days. Just 4 days, and now there were just 2 left. Even so, she couldn't help but pace back and forth. What would happen after they returned to Earth? They would have to come back to this world eventually, no. Would the siege still be here? Or would everything be transferred to Earth? They called this the trial. So was the main event going to bring everything back home? There were so many unknowns. How the fuck did this happen? She cursed under her breath. I have to go and fight, but I can't step outside of the city. But if I let them inside the city, I obviously can't use the barrier. Fuck. City lady, a voice came from outside of the doors. Cassare's cabin was far more substantial now and was quite elegant as well. She had an office with a window that overlooked the village, but she hadn't had the heart to look out there for a long time already. Every time she did, it felt like she was bleeding money. She had spent over 10,000 coins on a barrier that could withstand 20 million physical and replenish 1 million physical every hour at the cost of 100 coins every time. From her calculations, they did about 1,000 damage every 3 seconds, and that was accounting for the breaks they took. At that pace, accounting for the replenishing barrier, they did 200,000 damage every hour, which would put them over the 4-day mark before they could succeed in taking it down. But all of this would cost almost 20,000 coins total, and it would put her on the edge. Chapter 125, Forward. A village couldn't run without money, and they certainly couldn't make more in this situation. So when Gregory called her, she didn't even register it for a full 5 seconds. "Oh, right, yes, come in," she called. Gregory walked in and bowed. Kasari had gotten tired of telling him not to do that, and just acquiesced. "Miss Olivia has reported that Sir Silas has appeared." Kasari suddenly stood up straighter. No, this is bad. Her immediate reaction was to let him in, but it took time to deploy the barrier. In those seconds, it would be a simple matter for them to break in. She grit her teeth. This was a problem that wouldn't just disappear the moment the trial ended, anyway. Shouldn't they go all out in an attempt to stop it? "Take the barrier down," Kasari suddenly said. Gregory frowned. "City lady, this. Take it down, now." Kasari grabbed her long sword, sheathed and leaning against her desk. Gripping its sheath tightly, she took long steps toward the door, ready to take action herself. Gregory hurriedly followed after, trying to make a last-ditch attempt to change her mind, but... "That's enough," Kasari snapped, barely holding back the curses threatening to roll from her tongue. "Call the militiamen and adventurers. Prepare the villagers for retreat. We move now." Kasari's steps became even faster as she descended to the first floor of her cabin and opened the door with a snap. Quickly, she closed the distance toward a barrier of light guarded by 2 militiamen and stepped by them after receiving a nod from both. She clenched her jaw and interfaced with the window, shutting it all down. Silas felt like flashbangs of color were erupting in his mind. The night felt so bright and illuminated that it was almost as though the sun hadn't set at all. In his vision, the arc of the sword reflected not just where it was, but also where it had been and where it was going. He activated less than maddened enlightenment greater than and less than madness control greater than at the same time, and the world seemed to slow even further. He sidestepped the swing of the sword, but it arched back up instantaneously, aiming for the fragile flesh of his legs defended by little more than his fluttering loose pants. Less than solidify greater than. Silas didn't retreat like the swordsman expected. Instead, a barrier appeared right at his feet and a punch shattered ahead into a rain of sparkling crimson. The droplets of blood and mashed meat of flesh glittered particularly brightly amidst Silas' visualization. It felt like he was seeing life, and its relation with death, more clearly now than he ever had before. The others clearly didn't expect one of their own to fall so quickly, but their shock changed nothing. The last grip strength of the swordsman faltered as his sword was ripped out from his possession, slashing out in a beautiful arc that was eerily reminiscent of his first attack against Silas. Clang! In a pincer of 2, one defended against the sword strike while Silas closed in on the other. A spear swept out, only to clash against Silas' earlier cast of less than solidify greater than. And to Silas' surprise, the shield of ether didn't shatter. Weak, Silas thought, while his movements suddenly accelerated. He had thought that the combined attacks of 2 of these elites would use up the 200 physical that the shield could withstand, so he had lagged behind in his response a bit. But a single use of sudden burst quickly made up for that. As the spearmen reeled from the shock to their wrists, Silas unleashed a tail whip and a maelstrom of etherflow, bowing the man's head with such momentum that his bone shards splattered akin to the eruption of a grenade. The gore splattered against his ally, still occupied by the flight of a telekinesis-driven sword. Rak was taken aback. He had only turned his attention to the trolls for but a moment to call one forward, and yet 2 of his companions had fallen in such quick succession. Who was this monster? Grumlock, forward, he roared in his mind. At that moment, the barrier that had hounded them for days already was taken down, changing the situation entirely. Silas sighed inwardly. He knew this would happen, but this unfortunately made things a lot more complicated for him. The group could barely stand up against the rotten walls. How would they fare against this group of monsters? He would likely have to overextend himself. Either that, or he would need to make a display of power so grand that they chose to run away on their own. His gaze flickered as he noticed a charging Kasari, moving so fast that her long sword, dragging behind her, seemed to be able to ride on the wind. Her gaze was filled with determination, and she didn't look toward him even once. Likely because she knew just how disapproving his gaze would be. Clang! The sword under the control of Scylla's telekinesis slashed out in an arc eerily reminiscent of Tail Whip, forcing the female warrior back. "I'll give you all a single chance," Scylla suddenly spoke, his madness flourishing and touching their minds for a single instant before pulling away. They all felt the touch on their psyches, but it registered like an oppression due to the brevity. "I don't know why you're attacking Castlemaine, but leave now and we can end this here. I do not know where you come from, nor who sent you. It would be an easy matter for you to go. If you choose not to, I will make you suffer even worse casualties." Scylla spoke calmly. He was still surrounded by over half a dozen warriors, not to mention the troll that was looming overhead or Rak, who was a wild card he wasn't certain he could account for. But nonetheless, he had to speak these words. Although letting them go was its own form of trouble, he was working with a different set of information now. Chapter 126, Notice. 825 GT's bonus. He would be very surprised if this wasn't related to the informant Brandt spoke about. He had questioned the latter on some things on the way here, but he hadn't been able to find out much. All he knew was that the informant, too many people, was more likely an organization rather than just a single person. In this entire region, the large path of forest they had begun calling the Amazonian wilds, they had their hands in many pies. When Scylla asked why it was that they called them by the singular, Brandt said it was because everyone was contacted by the same androgynous voice, spoken by the same person every single time. But they found it hard to accept that a single person could have such a wide array of knowledge. It didn't make sense. This aside, he had already been targeted twice, and even though this wasn't a direct assault against him, it was hard for him to separate the matter entirely. This truly felt like the third time. It couldn't be a coincidence. He didn't believe in such coincidences. This was all to say that whether he killed all these people or not, it was likely that these attacks would still keep coming. But letting them go might lower the casualty count. Rak frowned when he heard Scylla's words. Why had he come here? Obviously, it was to conquer this city. He had the warriors and the personal skill. So long as he found a city of his own, his strength would skyrocket. Castlemaine was perfect. It had invested too much into advancement and not enough into personal strength. If he became its city lord, it would be a melding of two strengths into a true superpower. He had paid quite a pretty penny just to get this information, but now. This Scylla's was truly a wrench in his plans. Right now, not having a city wasn't a big deal. There were many who would probably bide their time, finding the perfect location before attempting a city stele quest. Very soon, the difference between those who controlled cities, or were among the top echelons of one, and those who weren't, would become akin to the haves and have-nots of this world. He couldn't allow himself to be among the have-nots. Should he? Rak narrowed his eyes and suddenly put two and two together. Inwardly, he sneered. Clearly, Scylla's was afraid of what might happen to the village during their stampede. Why not press on that weakness? Go, he said in a gruff voice. The two trolls to his back charged toward the village. Scylla's fell into silence. The ground shook beneath their heavy steps, the roar of clanging armor and shifting ether riding the wind and buffeting the trees. He had experienced a lot in this world since he came. The others had experienced 3 months, and he had experienced just over a week. It was only recently that his soft gene state finally ran out. Despite this, he hadn't really experienced many emotions. The closest he got was when he meditated on his madness, but there was a difference between recalling memories and experiencing something firsthand. When he killed, his baseline of emotions didn't shift either. He simply did what he felt would garner him the best outcome. But right now, standing in silence and letting the cool night air lick against his skin, he suddenly felt angry. He could see Rak's intentions in his eyes, the implicit threat that was the undercurrent of his words. It was the logical thing to do, smart, even. To target your opponent's weakness and capitalize on it. It was something that Silas himself had done several times already in his short time in this world. However, on one side, there was his logic. And on the other, there was something all too rare and nigh foreign to him. He suddenly felt that he understood those snakes, losing themselves in battle, in rage, in lust. It was madness. A ring of red appeared about Silas' green irises as his comprehension billowed out in waves. Grumlock the troll had already appeared before him, swinging down its club with a mighty momentum. The air pressure stung and the wind swing. With the way the moonlight caught the edge of it, one would have almost thought that it was a falling meteor from the skies, heating up beneath the rage of its sheer speed. Bang! Grumlock's head exploded, a spear appearing out the back of its skull. A trembling spear, its blade vibrating with 4 layered units of ether, shone in the night sky. Boom! It left a trail of exploding air in its wake as it accelerated, appearing before Rack in what felt like an instant. Rack's pupils constricted. His black irises seemed to become a whirlpool of sinking shock. Quickly, his ether circulated and an elaborate shield of silver and blue appeared before him, but the spear tore through it in an instant. The FFF Plus Elite used the split moment to raise his staff, ready to retaliate with the spear suddenly exploded, breaking into countless shards that pelted the surroundings. Rack felt as though he had been hit by a truck, but little did he know how lucky he was that the spear's durability had finally given out. With madness, Silas' telekinesis could output a physical of 121. But with the plus 200% strength effectiveness given by the trembling spear, its effective strength just now was over 350. Silas took a step forward, the sword he was wielding with his telekinesis rising up into the air before the spear-wielding woman and suddenly jetting out. He threw a fist, one that was perfectly timed, an illusory green punch following the butt of the sword, driving it into the woman's chest and through her defenses as though they were nothing more than Swiss cheese. Without even looking toward them, 2 spears rose into the air, a flood of ether making them shake and quake. With every second that ticked by, they lost a point of durability, but he didn't seem to notice. Chapter 127, Step Late. 900 GT's bonus. His hand rose into the skies and he pointed toward the 2 trolls charging toward the village. Astral Bind. In that moment, the 2 behemoths froze in place, unable to move a single inch. For every 10% gap and 0.5 units of ether, Silas from them for an entire second. Just one pulse of half a unit was enough to freeze them for almost 5 seconds. Rack was disoriented after the explosion, his head spinning. He couldn't quite understand what was happening, but when he finally managed to struggle up, he found a scene that was nothing short of absolute carnage. Silas was almost certain that these trolls were Rack's summons, which also meant, more likely than not, he'd have some sort of method to help them break free. But did it matter when the man couldn't even think straight? His group couldn't withstand even a single swipe of those spears. Silas skewered their chests through one after another before those 2 spears likewise exploded. Dead. All dead. Where? Rack's head snapped toward his trolls, only to realize they were bound in place, being assaulted by a group of people who couldn't even leave a scratch on them. A bind. No. Break free. He circulated his ether, prepared to unleash a skill when a fist appeared before his forehead, smashing him into the ground again. Silas' hand rose into the air, an illusory green hand forming around Rack's throat and squeezing over it tightly. Fatigue was beginning to pull at his body, but he didn't seem to notice, his cool, green eyes, rounded by a ring of red, looking into Rack's own as he squeezed the life out of him. Rack began to foam at the mouth, scratching and clawing at the hand on his throat, only to pass through air and scratch himself bloody. Silas could feel his blood boiling, his earlier rage having abated in the slightest. Just when the trolls were about to break free, Silas cast Astral Bind on them once more, seemingly not realizing that dual casting a skill shouldn't have been so easy. Something suddenly dawned on Silas. In the midst of a sea of blood, buried beneath layers of an irrational protective urge, there was a kernel of rationality that remained. This was what the system deemed to be an FFF plus of humanity. Why was he so weak? This was the best they had. What chance did they have to survive at the end of all of this? The ring of crimson slowly faded from Silas' eyes, and he could suddenly feel the great drain on his body. He had had ether flow activated for so long that the paths of ether hidden within his body were screaming. His torso was both cramping and aching as though he had just been branded by a hot iron. "Who sent you?" Silas asked in a voice that was far more raspy than he expected. His throat seemed to have dried out, his body overheating. His heart was threatening to beat out of his chest, thrumming with such fervor he thought it might want to shatter the very ribcage protecting it from the harshness of the world. Silas shook his head as Rack's eyes rolled into the back of his skull. What was he doing? How could the man even answer in this situation? He raised his head and looked toward the trolls again. Good, he thought. It had taken some time, but 10 seconds frozen was too much, even a creature with almost 250 constitution. He couldn't even see how much spears and swords had been driven through their eyes from his vantage point. They practically made them into a twin set of bouquets. Rack's body began to convulse due to the lack of air, no longer having the strength to claw at his throat, which was lacerated by blood wounds caused by none other than his own hands. Silas tossed the man to the ground and impaled a spear through his hip, much like he had done for Brandt. However, he made a mental note that he had to be much more careful. He couldn't read this man's stats even though he didn't seem to be using an active skill. That could only mean that he either had a passive ability, or his mental somehow surpassed Silas' own. It can't be that simple. I've been able to scan others who had higher mentals than me due to madness. But I'm stone-walled here. He is very dangerous even if he can't move. Silas swayed and pressed a hand against his forehead. He knew that he was ignoring something important. Just now, he had really lost himself to his emotions. It had been a very, very long time since that had happened. In fact, the last time. His mind flashed with memories of an arrogant jerk. He shook his head, not wanting to think about those thoughts. He distracted himself by watching the final strokes the group levied at the last trolls. The militiamen, Lauren, Alex, Morgan, Olivia, Cassari, they all fought together, bringing it down. A wooziness blurred Silas' vision. His consciousness faded in and out until he realized what was wrong. His heart, it really was beating a little too fast. He pressed a hand to his chest, the discomfort steadily growing. Wait. Silas' head snapped back toward a particular direction, and to his surprise, his gaze landed on Lauren. He was practically boring holes into her, and yet he couldn't understand why. Lauren Mitchell. Level, 1. Physical, 31. Mental, 17. Will, 13. He remembered her stats perfectly, and they were identical to the first time he had seen them. But why did they show up like that? Why couldn't he see the... Silas' eyes widened and he suddenly burst forward, the raging tempest in his heart. The avalanche of beats, as persistent as a rain of boulders falling from a mountain's peak, beat against his chest. But he was still a step late. Chapter 128, Betrayal. Her gaze locked onto Silas with a hint of surprise. She blinked innocently, a gaze that he hadn't seen from her before. She had been a gentle and mostly shy woman. She had a fierceness to her, honed through months in the Amazonian wilds, but it was mostly ebbed by her days as a secretary. Now, however, she looked almost playful, more like a woman that would let Silas walk in on her naked on purpose rather than by accident, as he had thought. She reached toward Cassari that had her back turned to her and suddenly ripped an inconspicuous necklace she had worn around her neck away. Then, she vanished as though a mirage in the desert. Silas came to a halt, his eyes wide. What just happened? She didn't kill anyone, she didn't even really harm them. She just took a necklace. What was going on? Silas stood in silence for a long time, looking out in blank space. His heart was thumping wildly, even now. In fact, it was only getting worse. It somehow felt to him like what had just happened was worse than anything else could have been, and the worst part about it was that he had no idea why. He was almost certain that this was all a result of his improved luck stat. But he didn't like the push and pull of these inexplicable emotions. It felt like a different sort of manipulation of his mind, one that was an offshoot of madness, but not quite the same. And the most poignant point was that while madness at least helped him to understand himself to a greater degree, this did nothing of the sort. In fact, if it wasn't for madness, he wouldn't even quite understand what was happening. There was only one thing that was clear to him. Somehow, he had just lost a game he wasn't even aware he was playing. And that feeling threatened to send him into another spiral. Silas, are you all right? Silas didn't know how long he stood there for, but when he looked up, he found that Kasari was standing right in front of him, looking up into his eyes. Quote ellipsis. What did she just take from you? He needed to know. The thoughts were consuming him. Just now, he had replayed every interaction he had ever had with Lauren, but they were so few and far in between that he couldn't glean anything. Their most substantive interaction was the first morning he had spent in Castlemaine, but the conversation took place on an abstract plane. It felt, there was nothing tangible to grasp from it. There was only one point of oddity that he zeroed in on. That day, the one where he, Olivia and the others set out on their mission against the Knoll village, his madness had enveloped everyone. Everyone had their own reactions to the situation, but when he thought about it, Morgan and Olivia were much more subdued, Alex was enamored with his axe, and Lauren, she felt into a ball on the ground, hiding her. Silas' gaze suddenly sharpened. He moved before anyone could react and he cast Astral Bind. The illusion chain of ether constricted Alex into place. The cheery young man was entirely stunned, taken off guard, much like everyone else was. But before he could react, a blade fragmented was already pressed against his throat. Who are you people? Silas asked coldly. The next thing out of your mouth better be an answer, or else the first thing to go will be your carotid artery. Silas realized that he had been a fool. It was staring him right in the face, and he hadn't even noticed it. That day, Alex had looked like he wanted to bed his axe, as though it was a voluptuous woman rather than an inanimate object. Then there was Lauren, who dropped to the ground as though she was experiencing the greatest fear of her life. He hadn't thought much of it back then because it was the first time he had enveloped anyone with his madness, but how many battles had he fought since then? He had been able to see how madness interacted with humanoid creatures again, and again, and again. Fear and lust weren't the appropriate responses. Unless you felt an assault on your mind you could resist, but weren't sure of exactly how to pretend like you had been affected in the first place. Seeing the cold indifference in Silas' gaze, Alex's confusion vanished and his demeanor seemed to change as well. Clearly, he hadn't expected this outcome, but his reaction wasn't one of fear either. You're smart. PCHU. Alex's eyes widened. This time, it wasn't an act, because it was too late. The blade shard pushed into his neck, severing one of his carotid arteries. Blood splattered, and Alex found himself quickly losing large amounts of blood. He had never expected for this to happen. He hadn't taken Silas' threat seriously. Wasn't it just human nature to wait to hear him out first? Alex's ether suddenly rampaged and Astral Bind shattered. He shuffled backward with great speed, clutching onto one side of his neck. I've been careless, he mumbled to himself in shock. He had the strength to not fear Silas, and yet he had actually let his bravado underestimate this man one more time. He was shocked enough when he couldn't read Silas' stats, but after some time they came to understand that this wasn't because he was such a freak, but rather because he had gained some unique comprehension that protected his mind better than most other things could. After observing him for a time, they were quite certain of Silas' limits. What they didn't account for was his decisiveness. Alex coughed, but didn't hesitate to rip large amounts of cloth off his body and jam them into his neck as he continued to retreat with frightening speed. Everyone was still in shock, not understanding what was going on. Chapter 129, Fatigue. Silas had just suddenly attacked Alex, and they hadn't even managed to get a grasp on the situation before the latter was heavily injured. There was no time to explain. Silas could only rush after him, casting Astral Bind again, only to be rebuffed by some mysterious strength. Alex glared daggers at Silas as though trying to bore the man's visage into his psyche. He felt humiliated, but he also felt that it was his fault. It wasn't just Silas' stats that had calmed him, but also the fact the man was at the end of his rope. And yet somehow he had still let this happen. Suddenly, Silas took out the second trembling spear from his madness key. His eyes reflected with a cold, indifferent glint, his emotions unreadable. Alex's gaze glinted. That was the second item they wanted to procure in this excursion, a serendipitous coincidence, if you will. But the cards hadn't fallen. A normal person would have let the guard down after Lauren exposed herself, but somehow Silas had seen through him. Clearly, there was some sort of flaw the two had left behind. Alex's body suddenly gleamed like metal beneath the moon's light as he pushed out against the coming spear. The clash shook his arm, but he used the momentum to carry him backward even further, using his agility to slip into the cascade of trees. Silas, stop, Kasari called out. You're too spent. She had seen how heavily Silas had been breathing until just now. But it wasn't just that he was tired, he was clearly brash as well. She was usually the rash one. It was Silas who was the voice of reason. If he was so certain that Alex was a traitor, why not use him as bait? This would make things more troublesome. What Kasari hadn't considered was that Silas felt he had no choice. The methods of these people were too deep. They could hide their stats, apparently they could fake their affiliations as well, or else Kasari would have long since seen through their favorability. Lauren had somehow just disappeared into thin air, and just now Alex had managed to keep his hand after lashing out against the equivalent of over 350 effective strength with just a fist. You could only use such a tactic against people you understood the limits of. If you didn't understand where their limits lay, then you'd just end up dying before you understood what was going on. Even so, Silas came to a stop, his breath coming out in heaves. Kasari was right. He really didn't have the strength left to go after him. Just those few failed casts of astral bind and pumping that spear full of ether just now had made those searing paths within him cry out in horror again. It felt like he had just dumped a bunch of rubbing alcohol on an open, festering wound. However, that didn't mean things would end like this. No. The sudden cry came from the forest and a familiar figure was sent flying back into the wet marsh. Alex landed in the tall, wet grass, scrambling backward. He still had a hand pressed heavily into his neck, but his gaze was flickering with emotions that ranged from astonishment to fear. At that moment, a black snake slithered into view, barely perceptible under the night air. In fact, if not for the two orbs of crimson that pulsed with their own light, its silhouette would be hardly discernible. Alex didn't understand. Beasts this strong shouldn't appear in this location of the Amazonian wilds. They were much further into the rainforest, at least hundreds of kilometers from this location. How could only be here? He had already lost way too much blood. His effective stats were plummeting by the second and the healing elixirs he had only worked as well as he could avoid getting injured again. This was the absolute worst-case scenario. Or so it seemed. At that moment, a small bead of flesh suddenly appeared. He couldn't react as it burst, a greenish liquid falling over him and his wounds. It was yet another situation that he simply didn't understand at all until he was suddenly paralyzed. No matter how hard he tried to move, his nerve endings simply wouldn't receive his mind's signals. Even worse, his ether had slowed to a crawl. This was also absolutely infuriating. He was certain that under normal circumstances, his constitution would be strong enough to shrug off this low-level venom. But now, Alex lay there, helpless, a black-scaled creature looming over him while another green-eyed beast, this time in human skin, loomed behind him. I asked you a question, Silas' voice came from behind him as everyone else caught up. Who are you? Silas frowned when Alex didn't answer. I know your constitution is high enough to resist the venom and speak. This time, if you don't reply, I will just kill you. Alex's spine tingled. The last time Silas made such an ultimatum, he had really died. He truly didn't dare to. The arrow came out of nowhere. Maybe it was because Silas' mind was too fatigued from the continuous battles, but that wasn't how he remembered it. When he recalled this day, he would remember something too fast, too slippery, too steeped in shadows to react to. It tore through Alex's mouth, through the roof of his skull, and plunged into the soft soil, causing an eruption of dirt. Silas' gaze flashed as his head turned sharply toward the direction it had come from. Or, rather, the direction he thought it had come from. It was truly too sudden and too fast, and with how the arrows of this world could curve, the angle it hit the ground at was useless information to him. If only that beautiful tapestry of colors his mind had been able to form earlier hadn't vanished under his fatigue. Silas stood in silence, as did everyone else. Chapter 130, or not. 975 GT's bonus. They didn't understand what he did, but given how things had ended, they could piece some things together. They had been betrayed by not just one, but two of their own. And for reasons beyond their understanding. They had seen it fit to silence Alex. Silas' gaze dimmed. He reached down and pressed a hand to Alex. Alex Reynolds. Gene detected. Common gene, 4. Speed, F. 4. Dexterity, F. 2. Will, F. Bronze gene. 1. Strength. 2. Constitution. 1. Intelligence, attempt assimilation. Yes, no. Silas didn't say a word for a long while. It was the first time he was seeing a bronze gene, and the realization made him not know what to think. How could that little blade cut his neck if he had 2 bronze constitution genes? Was it because he was in a state of wealth? Or was it because the method he and Lauren had used to conceal their stats dampened them as well? There were too many questions. Too many unknowns. Kasari, tell me, Silas asked softly. Kasari hesitated for a moment, then sent him a message through the system, something he didn't even know was possible until now. If it was, why hadn't she contacted him earlier? It was a luck stat treasure. It was able to increase your luck stat by 400%. Silas fell into silence once more. Thinking about the changes to himself when his luck stat increased, he realized that this was a huge deal. He had gone from believing that humans were far too weak in one moment to suddenly feeling lost in another. But was all of this a good thing? Or not? The atmosphere of Castlemaine was odd. It was too quiet given the situation they had just survived, but there were also a sea of eyes that were wide awake nonetheless. Many of them stood huddled together near the center, half evacuated and half not. They seemed to have been corralled beneath Gregory's soothing words, and whatever fear they might have had was washed away. A group consisting of Silas, Kasari, Olivia, and Morgan, as well as the militiamen, of which Silas had noticed 2 were strikingly missing, walked toward them quite somberly, having left the battlefield half cleaned. Gregory looked back toward them with a bright smile on his face. Our heroes are back, everyone. The cheers of the villagers only sounded now as though they were ignorant of what had just happened. Kasari took it in with a smile, the worry that had weighed her down being whisked away into the cool night air. Ellipsis. The night passed quickly, but not without its share of trepidation. The villagers might have been in a relieved state, but the higher echelon of the village was in shambles. They had just lost 2 supporting pillars, one by death and another by betrayal. Their location had been revealed to those that were likely enemies lurking in the dark, and now it was unknown when they might face their next assault. The Knoll village had fallen just over half a week ago now. The time for the next humanoid village to spawn was quickly coming up, and yet they were stuck in this precarious situation with the end of the trial looming over their heads. It was unknown if there would even be a temporary relief to look forward to either. Once it was confirmed that a part of the population had suddenly gained powers, who knew what would happen to the world? How would the people in power try to maintain their power? And what would happen to those who suddenly had more power than they knew what to do with? Would the normal boundaries of the world even remain? It was with these thoughts swirling in their minds that a morning meeting was held. Kasari, Olivia, Morgan, and Silas were present. There was also Gregory, mostly out of necessity rather than a willingness. Kasari couldn't treat Gregory like an NPC as much as she wanted to. If she tried to hide things from him, he would know. So, even though their worries were related to a world Gregory had no understanding of, Kasari had him participate anyway. She gave everyone a look, her gaze lingering on Silas, who looked like a mess. Well, a mess compared to his usual self. He had taken a bath and had even replaced his pants with a new pair of linen. He had even found a simple linen shirt to wear. However, even this couldn't hide the sheer abuse his body had been through. Just on the parts of his skin she could see, he was covered in deep bruises and half-healed cuts. His eyes were somewhat sunken as though he hadn't gotten enough rest, and the Silas she remembered had been clean-shaven for all his life. Now, however, there was a distinct shadow gathering on his handsome features. Had he been around for months like they had, this shadow would have already become a full-blown bush, but even now it felt out of place. I kind of like it, she thought to herself with a smile before she met everyone else's gazes. Soon, the trial will end and we will return home. Honestly, I have no understanding of what this means for Castlemaine, but I think we should probably address the elephant in the room. Morgan's gaze dimmed somewhat. In this place, he was the outsider. He half expected to suffer a great amount of scrutiny. Who would have thought that 2 of them would be spies? I partially blame myself, Kasari said with a sigh. I trusted the favorability ratings too much. As with everything in this world, it should all be taken with a grain of salt, so I want to incorporate some new guardrails to hopefully avoid such a thing in the future. But for now, this isn't what I want to consider. There isn't enough time, or nearly enough of us to put my thoughts into action. And after my necklace was stolen, well, many things will become far more difficult. Chapter 131, Top 1050 GT's Bonus. Instead, I want to apologize to you all. It was my job as the city lady to prepare for such an outcome. Morgan didn't expect that the first thing Kasari would want to do was this, but when he looked at her now, he felt his own favorability increasing despite himself. A heavy weight that had been on his chest was slowly put down. Now that we've gotten the unfortunate stuff out of the way, I think I should also shed some light on some things. While we've suffered a blow, we've also gained a lot. There are 3 troll corpses, and we've also managed to gather several powerful treasures from the battlefield as well. Kasari began to explain the gains, livening up the mood. Silas noticed that she didn't mention using the humans for their genes and only did so with the trolls, but he felt that this was only to be expected. Silas didn't expect that everyone would be as nonchalant about using the genes of their fellow humans for improvement. City lady, if I may say something, just when Kasari was about to get into the details of the end of the trial, Gregory spoke up. Yes. I do know a little bit about the end of the trial. Kasari was pleasantly surprised. Please. It wasn't just Kasari either, everyone was curious. Gregory cleared his throat. This is information I've been made aware of so that I might properly guide you in making decisions. From my understanding, most administrative personnel like myself will be informed of this basic knowledge. Please use it to inform your decisions. The summoning is a process of integration between your world and wider existence. During this event, your world will be split into 2, not in a literal sense, but in a more metaphysical sense. The process of the summoning is the real plane of existence that is your planet, fusing together with this ether-dense plane. Once the trial concludes, this process will begin, but only slowly. As such, in the beginning, there will be no ether on your planet, meaning that while you might keep your physical prowess, your more fantastical abilities will be sealed off from you. However, this explanation shouldn't steer you wrong. It isn't that your planet needs this ether plane and not the other way around. The ether plane needs an anchor in reality. You can imagine it like a fabric of space and time. It has no substance if it's not in relation to other things. The so-called 9 attempts are the limit of the ether plane. If it fails 9 times, it will either collapse or be forced to pick a different world to integrate with. After this 9th failure, Earth will be pulled along and be tethered to this different world as well, and ultimately you'll lose all rights to rule yourselves. If you survive, that is. The process of tethering to a different world is very violent, and it's likely that very few, if any at all, would survive this outcome. The extinction events that result from failure would be on a far smaller scale than this. Gregory let his words hang in the air, and everyone felt the weight of them. Those extinctions had sometimes wiped out more than 90% of Earth's population, and yet this was supposedly worse than all of that. Setting this aside, once the trial has concluded, you will be able to return to Earth, and gateways will form. You will be able to travel back and forth between your planet and the ether plane by making use of these gateways, but they will also be a trial for Earth as well. This location is just the outskirts of the Amazonian wilds, but the gateways that will appear can do so from anywhere, at any time. The closer to the end of the summoning your world comes, the more frequent these occurrences will be until there is little difference between the ether plane and your planet. As for the final step, I am hazy on this matter because it is said that it is very different depending on the world, its grade, and the integration type. It should even be affected by surrounding successful summonings as well. But from my layman's understanding, in order to succeed in the final step, the ether plane and your planet need a stabilizing force of some kind, while you also need to combat destabilizing forces. These destabilizing forces are often events of the system. Dungeons, quick-time events, quests, even powerful extinct creatures. The more of these remain unresolved, the stronger your stabilizing force needs to be to counter them. That is everything I know. Everyone fell into their thoughts, somewhat understanding and somewhat not. Gregory still hadn't explained what a stabilizing force was. And the destabilizing forces, how many of them did they need to clear? It couldn't be them all, right? And why were the extinct creatures counted? That felt odd. Silas wasn't sure what to think either. He felt that they were missing too much information, but once again, it was impossible for him to ask the madness key about the situation unless he wanted to get slapped with another hunger spike. Thank you, Gregory, Kassarai smiled, feeling that it was good that she had invited him. In that case, I believe our best choice is to attempt to meet on the other side, no? She let the question hang in the air. Everyone looked toward one another and eventually nodded. Silas frowned. This might be difficult for him. Would the Browns let him leave? And if he did so, what would it mean for his family? Unless he was strong enough to not worry about the Browns, or the Grimblades as they called themselves now, it was impossible for him to make such a choice. As strong as Alex had been, or even Lauren, neither had been on the top 10 list, while it was a Grimblade that firmly held that top place. Chapter 132, Except 1125 GT's bonus. There was a chance that they had the ability to obscure the truth much like they had with Kassarai's favorability. But Silas didn't want to bank on it. There was a good chance that the trio of the Grimblades was even more powerful than them, and they definitely had a greater supporting cast around them as well. Kassarai already knew of Silas' situation, so she spoke first. Silas and I live in the same area. We can come together first. Olivia, you know the location already. Morgan, I am not sure where you live, but you don't need to tell me. You're one of us now, so if you can, bring those you can to Viridian. I live in a town close by to the famous university. Silas over here is one of the tenured professors. Both Morgan and Olivia blinked in surprise, looking towards Silas at the same time. Really, he's so young, Morgan said with a breath. The world didn't have a universal university ranking system, but every country had their own clear number one, and they all shared the same prestige. Viridian was without a doubt the number one ranked university of the United Coalition of Terra Nova. Olivia chuckled. No wonder, everything makes sense now. Silas raised an eyebrow, but didn't pursue the line of questioning. Instead, he gave Kassarai a look that only she would take as his version of thanks. As for everyone else, it just looked like his normal, indifferent gaze. That location is quite far for me, Morgan replied honestly. I live in the Celestial Republic, across the ocean. The Celestial Republic was located in what had once been China before the sixth extinction. Without understanding what the situation would be like on the other side when they returned, this would, indeed, be tricky. Kassarai leaned back, tapping her finger on her armrest. This was, indeed, a problem. Gregory, what do you think? Should we have Morgan stay put? Kassarai asked. It's possible, city lady. There could be some benefit in having two foundations instead of just one. You have to remember that once your village becomes a town, it's possible to form subsidiary branches of your power. Having a location that is already well established could be more beneficial than not. There are some pros and cons to weigh, though. Gregory was quite tactful, but his meaning was clear. This was a matter of whether Morgan could be trusted or not. Kassarai looked into Morgan's eyes and made a decision. When Silas saw the fire in her eyes, he couldn't help but smile a bit. The person the most pissed off about what had happened wasn't Silas, it was without a doubt Kassarai. And when this woman was backed into a corner, she didn't cower, she preferred to lash out and bite back. Morgan, soon, a specialty armor created thanks to the beast pelts Silas brought back will be completed. I will give it to you along with 10,000 coins and a noble title. This noble title will allow you to recruit vassals for yourself, who will by proxy become our supporters as well. Do you accept? A few more details of their coming operation were hashed out, and by the time the meeting ended, the sun had already been high in the sky for a while and was beginning to ebb away into the front end of an early evening. Quote ellipsis. Don't worry, city lady. I will appease seamstress Maya. I believe that she will be very happy. The trolls do not have furs, but their hides are thicker than any beast. It will be an easy task. I will leave that to you, then. I'm sure everyone wants some rest now, so please enjoy the rest of your days. I will take a small break as well. With that, everyone left one after another, leaving Olivia and Kassarai behind. Silas stepped out from the office, exhaling a slow breath. He had been in this world for barely over a week and yet so much had happened. He was looking forward to seeing his family again. Silas, can we talk? Silas looked over to find Morgan. He nodded and followed. What did you want to talk about? Silas asked. Morgan sighed. Honestly, I didn't expect to get strapped in like this to a bunch of youths like you all, but after I heard you were a professor as well, I thought that you would probably understand me the most. As well, Silas asked. Morgan smiled. I'm a professor at King. It seems we have more in common than I thought. King was to Morgan's country what Viridian was to Silas' own. It was no doubt at that top-tier echelon. Oh, what do you research? There seemed to be a glint in Morgan's eyes before he replied, as though he wanted to see through Silas first. Psychology. That's a pretty broad response, Silas replied. Though he said this, he remembered Morgan correcting Alex on his understanding of sociopaths when they first met. He hadn't thought much of it back then because it was semi-common language, but it seemed that there was more to it. You're right, I'm used to replying with that because it's what most people understand. You could say that I study neurodivergence. Mental illness. Morgan laughed. Silas was, indeed, much like what he thought he would be. It does sound like a new, politically correct term. But no, I mean neurodivergence. And by that, I mean in the sense of people who seem to have superhuman mental capacities. Kind of like you. Silas shook his head. I don't believe that I'm special enough to be categorized like that. My memory is a standard deviation better than most, as is my spatial awareness, but most of everything else is based on diligence. I didn't come to diagnose you, though I don't like that word. I believe that it has a negative connotation when it shouldn't. Either way, I will take your word for it. I only called you here to say thank you. This time, Silas was surprised. Quote ellipsis. Why? Chapter 133, Slots. 2200 PS's bonus. Because I believe the city lady trusts you almost implicitly. It's because you never suspected me that she chose to show such trust in me. This opportunity is better than any I could have expected. So, thank you for that. Silas looked into Morgan's eyes. They were a deep brown and carried an inconspicuous amount of intelligence that Silas had never noticed. He considered himself to be quite an astute person, but he had never seen this side of Morgan as well. He realized then that there were more ways for a person to be dangerous outside of their stats. The informant never once showed their face. Or maybe they did. Either way, how much trouble had they given him without raising a single finger? Morgan wasn't likely a traitor, not in Silas' opinion. If he was, he would have never shown Silas this side of himself. It would have been far smarter to continue hiding it. But now that he had. Silas reached out a hand and shook Morgan's. Later in the day, Silas entered Cassare's cabin and met her in her office. So what do you want to do? Cassare asked. Silas didn't need to question what she meant. She was obviously referring to the fact she had lied to everyone on his behalf when they both knew that he definitely couldn't come. Right now, he was pretty well strapped to the Browns. There was little he could do. I don't believe that they'll truly restrict my movements, at least not completely. They will definitely do so in part, especially after they noticed that I entered the trial after they, let's say, gently encouraged most not to. If I'm correct, after we return, they'll actually have no choice but to let us out. Why's that? Because originally, their intentions were to use the trial to decide who was most worthy of becoming the city lord of their bronze stele. But now that the trial's been cut short, the two lagging behind the current leader will definitely argue for another opportunity. That will be my chance. Your chance? Cassare's eyes squinted. You're going to do something fucking stupid again, aren't you? I can see right through you, Silas. All of this is just because you don't want to follow their orders, isn't it? They probably haven't even done anything bad to you. Silas cleared his throat. There actually is a good reason to not trust them. Oh, pray tell. Cassare leaned back into her chair with an amused expression. Things aren't adding up, Silas said. They say they mixed races to give us the best chance at survival, so why are there still families? Why was my grandfather ostracized for marrying the wrong woman? Why is this the first I've heard of this summoning in my mid-20s and not when I was old enough to read? If they really cared about the world, and not maintaining power for themselves, they would have disseminated this information long ago. You're missing something, Cassare suddenly said. Silas waited for her to continue. If they didn't care to keep up pretenses even that much, then why force the races of the world to be homogeneous in the first place? I've been thinking about that as well, and I believe the answer is actually right in front of us. Kasari raised an eyebrow. Intelligence is difficult to grasp. All methods of measuring it have one weakness or another, and the markers are so multi-layered and complex that they're impossible to pinpoint. There's a reason so many believe in the existence of a soul. It's hard to grasp that everything is related to a lump of meat in our skulls. However, physical gifts are different. If two tall people marry one another, their child will likely be tall. If two athletes marry one another, their child will likely be athletic. Quote ellipsis. You're saying that they mixed the races to benefit from the best of everyone. Not just that, Silas said softly. If I'm correct, the fusion of the races is likely a key to evolving our race grade in the future. They never did it for the sake of harmony. These people don't care about that stuff. All they care about is maximizing their chances at being the ruling class once Earth makes it to the other side. Silas lay in the bed of his cabin. He took deep breaths, his thoughts running at inconceivable speeds. Something Morgan said interested him. Whether he was neurodivergent or not didn't matter to him. What did matter was that his mind had shifted back toward the scientific method for a moment. Would it be possible to use his university as a foundation to help analyze the Basilisk King's genome better? He couldn't analyze it all, but could a computer not? The question was whether he could make the transfer or not. He lay there, watching as the timer slowly drifted down. Soon, there were only 3 seconds left and he felt himself relaxing. Time remaining, 0 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds. A blinding flash of white filled Silas' eyes. He could have sworn that he would appear right back in his room, but to his surprise, he actually landed right back in the world of white he had entered before the trial. He looked around with hints of confusion before the world flickered and what looked like a slot machine appeared. It somehow seemed deeper and more profound than a usual slot machine, but ultimately, it couldn't be classified as anything else. Tickets. Calculating. Calculating. Is it evaluating my trial performance? The tickets, I assume, will let me use the slot machine. I haven't heard of this before. Tickets, 44. Silas wondered what that number was based on, but he didn't really want to speculate so he ignored it for now. He looked at the slot machine, wondering what secrets it would reveal to him. Would you like to sacrifice 10 tickets for a higher grade slot machine? Fragmented slot machine. Chapter 134, Flow. Oh. Silas didn't think for very long and sacrificed 35 of his tickets. It took 10 to get a common slot machine and 25 to get a bronze one. Unfortunately, he needed 50 to get a silver one, and he was already running out of tickets to begin with. I assume that the reason so many tickets were given is because getting anything at all is difficult. But, my luck should be higher than most, and even if it wasn't. 9 chances at a bronze item should be better than over 40 chances at a fragmented one. There was another reason he did this as well. He had thought that luck would just be an intangible, hardly noticeable, abstract stat. But almost the moment he got it, he felt the significant change. Then, there was Lauren. Was it a coincidence that a slot machine had appeared here not long after she stole Cassare's luck necklace? With his intention, Silas slotted in a ticket and watched the machine roll. The 3 slots pinged into place, all on different items. A city stele, a sword, and a gene state elixir. Silas' brows shot up as he realized something. Was this another chance to benefit from those 3 starting items again? And maybe this time, of even higher quality. Either way, it didn't matter. His first roll was a dud. He used another ticket, and once again, there was nothing. He went for a third time, and there was nothing once again. Silas continued without the slightest fluctuation in his expression. He was already prepared to get nothing at all. However, on the 4th, something changed. The slots came to a stop on a row of 3 daggers. No, they looked more like hollowed-out kunai, sparkling with a silvery light. With a thrum of light, the slot machine opened up and presented an orb of light. Flying kunai, 3, bronze. Level, 1. Ability, Pierce, Evolve. Increase strength effectiveness by less than 1% greater than for every less than 0.1 greater than units of ether, level up requirement, less than 1 common greater than gene. Durability, 5/5. Silas immediately noticed that this set of flying kunai used the old grading system and not the new. That seemed to come with an evolve ability that allowed him to use genes to level it up. He couldn't help but wonder what its limits were comparatively speaking. At the very least, it started far weaker than even weapons, but could it grow beyond them? It was yet another thing that he had to spend genes on, but all things considered, this was a good item for him. He even suspected that although the slot machine failed a lot, when it did succeed, it would tend to give him what he needed. Maybe this was also related to his elevated luck stat as well, though it was hard to tell. Silas guided the orbs of light into his madness key, then continued. Thankfully, the madness key doesn't need a constant flow of ether like other spatial devices, or else it would be useless back on Earth. Silas continued to spin the slot machine. The 5th attempt was a failure, as was the 6th, but with the 7th, there was another change. Silas' eyes lit up. The slot machine stopped on a familiar crystal, a gene crystal. Bronze gene crystal, F treasure. One's genetic code is a universe within the universe. Endless and vast, the number of meandering paths it can take are uncountable. Use this bronze gene crystal and begin to forge your own path. Capacity, 70. When Silas saw the capacity, though, he couldn't help but be disappointed. The common gene crystal he had gotten had a capacity of 50 genes, meaning that he could fuse together 50 of them to create a new unique gene. From his understanding, fragmented gene crystals had capacity ranging from 1 to 10, for common it was 11 to 50, and for bronze it was 51 to 200. He had ended up with a gene crystal on the lower end of the bronze gene crystal spectrum, so the results were bound to be a weaker upgrade compared to the absorption of his first. In addition, because it was a lower end, the boost he would get for sacrificing the crystal was limited as well. With his common gene crystal of 50 capacity, sacrificing it boosted his chance of absorbing the genes by 90%. But a bronze gene crystal with a 70 capacity would only give him a less than 50% chance, an amount comparable to a common gene crystal with a capacity of only 11. Of course, he had other boosts that could help him out. But his soft gene state had already run out and now he was beginning to understand the plight of everyone else. It was a hard life walking around with a rigid gene state. Even if he raised his stat limits, he would still be unable to absorb any genes. This is still better than not having it. I'll consider whether to use madness as a foundation again. Or maybe use the Grimblade gene as a foundation. Blade Aura could be very useful if it was improved again. Silas decided to consider this later. It was a hard decision. On the one hand, madness was his strongest foundation and one he should build upon. But with Etherflow active, Blade Aura synergized with it well. Silas rolled again and, to his surprise, the slot machine clicked into place once again. This time, it looked to be a skill booklet. No, it's different. The patterns are different. The flow of battle, silver, quest. The laws have sensed your flow of battle more than once. However, suppressed by a comprehension much deeper and profound, it has been unable to shine its way through. The pugilists, warriors, and berserkers of the past lament this tragedy and seek to give you an opportunity. Find your flow of battle and conquer it. Fragmented reward requirements. Greater than defeat an enemy one level above you. Common reward requirements. Greater than defeat an enemy 5 levels above you, bronze reward requirements. Greater than defeat an enemy 10 levels above you, silver reward requirements. Greater than defeat an enemy 15 levels above you. Chapter 135, Mortimer. Silas' eyes snapped open, finding a familiar, yet not so familiar ceiling above him. He had only slept one night in the bed before, so unsurprisingly, he was probably more used to his bed in Castlemaine than this bed in the Brown family compound. Silas sat up and a familiar wave of pain hit him. He looked down at himself and found that he was still covered in the same bruises, but was also somehow wearing the same blue striped pajamas he had been wearing before he entered the trial. At the same time, the scorned wraps and the madness key had magically appeared on him as well. He sighed. It seemed that there was no escaping them. He would probably have to wear gloves and a long-sleeved shirt from now on just to hide the scorned wraps, but he wondered if that would bring more attention to them than not. He stood slowly, wanting to go and shower and more importantly, shave. He knew it would probably be impossible to hide from his family that he had gone when they had explicitly hoped that he would not, but since he had come back alive, he assumed it would be easier to smooth that over anyway. The door to his room had an outline of light though it should still be the dead of night. According to his understanding, during the trial, time was frozen. Most of the world, at least on this hemisphere, should be in bed right now. Though, it was hard to say if that'd last for long. But what caught his attention more than that was the fact there was a shadow through the outline of light. Someone was standing before his door. Silas walked toward it and opened it. The first thing he saw was a little girl in a pink gown. She was half reaching for the doorknob and half bawling her eyes out. Clearly, she was scared to see what might or might not be on the other side. He could have sworn that he already appeased her. Between her and his parents, she had been the hardest to convince that he definitely wouldn't go. It seemed that he could be a bit naive too. She didn't believe him even a little bit. Alara looked up with red eyes, and when she saw that it was Silas, she was startled at first before she jumped at him, her sobs coming in waves. Having been containing herself for so long, she could no longer stand it. She hiccuped and wheezed, barely breathing properly. A pang of guilt echoed in Silas' heart, a sigh leaving his lips. "What are you crying for, little munchkin? Aren't I here?" Alara didn't answer, crying harder. She had only seen Silas for a brief moment, but how could she not notice the changes in her brother? He had just magically gone from clean-shaven to a scruffy beard in what was effectively a few seconds. They said that kids were more intelligent than adults gave them credit for, and it seemed that Silas was learning that the hard way. Alara had been holding back her sobs before, but after seeing Silas she couldn't contain it any longer, and the noises quickly caught the attention of his parents and grandfather. Another sigh came from Silas as the tired eyes of his parents appeared, blinking under the lights of the hallway and widening when they noticed the changes in Silas. "Well, it seems I'll have to face this music earlier than I thought," Silas thought to himself. Ellipsis. It took quite a while for Silas to calm everyone down. His grandfather even pretended to be angry with him as well, shirking all responsibility. But honestly, seeing them act like this, Silas felt a rare peace. At least in the last more than week, he hadn't experienced such a thing. He had mostly gone to the trial for selfish reasons, but being with his family now, it felt like he had more purpose than he thought. When the time came, the foundation he laid in the trial would be what helped his family stay just as safe and carefree. Well, most of them, anyway. As for his little munchkin of a sister, she insisted on sleeping with him again as though he might try to disappear again. She harumphed, turning her back to him and stealing all the covers for herself. Silas smiled and let her throw her tantrum. He'd have to find a way to make it up to her when the sun rose. The location was a simple office, or so it seemed. The more one looked, though, the more extraordinary it became, carrying the location was a simple office, or so it seemed. The more one air of a place entrenched in wealth rather than being new to it. The desk was made of a solid oak slab that would have cost hundreds of thousands to commission from a woodworker. The white carpet that would sway like grass if there was a crosswind was made from a rare polar bear hide. Even the pens that stuck out from a carefully carved ornament would have been worth thousands of dollars each. And yet it was easy to ignore these things due to the man that sat behind it. He wore simple silk robes and held a cigar, puffing out tufts of smoke from time to time. His eyes looked much older than his countenance, carrying a deep wisdom. But his face itself was covered in a mostly black beard with strands of white and grey, his hair carrying a deliberate, slick style to it that gave him a modern touch. This man was Mortimer Grimblade, and it was a name that would shock most because he was the founder of the Browns' money-making empire, a man who should have been the grandfather to Silas' own grandfather, and yet here he was, alive and well. Astrid, Lucius, and Malachi stood in a row before this man, their backs straight and their eyes sharp. Chapter 136, 7th. 400 PS's bonus. I've heard that many of our returnees didn't heed our advice, entering the trial anyway. Mortimer spoke in a deep voice. Yes, the three spoke at the same time, each one wanting to get the initiative. They had also had their own reports to give, but when they spoke at once like this, they were forced to stop. If they tried to talk over one another, they would just earn themselves the disdain of this man. Mortimer chuckled. He could see through the thoughts of these descendants of his, and he didn't mind it. This was how a Grimblade should be. And what do you think we should do with them? One by one, this time. Starting with you, Mortimer pointed his cigar at Malachi. Standing up straighter, Malachi replied. Those not smart enough to grasp our implied meanings can't be nurtured. They've overstepped their bounds and should be treated as such. There's no need to act directly against them, but they shouldn't be priorities. Instead, we can use them as a lesson to others, and a constant reminder of what it means to ignore our words. Mortimer nodded and turned to Lucius. And you? I believe that it will depend. That they did isn't as important as why they did. We should observe them, maybe even reward them so that they show more of the true natures. If they entered the trial because of curiosity, it can be forgiven, and that courage should be nurtured. If they entered because of ambition, those wills should be crushed, and I believe we should find an opportunity to get rid of them. The dead are not a threat. Mortimer nodded once again, his expression still giving nothing away before he looked toward Astrid. And you? I believe that the more ambitious they are, the better. This is how the Grimblades should be. A dull tool is not a useful tool. It is the job of a leader to wield them, and the job of a warrior to not be harmed by their own double-edged blade. The head of the Grimblades should have the confidence to use their people. If we knew to them all, what would be the point? We would be a family without generals. Ha ha, Mortimer suddenly laughed, slapping a palm on his desk before rising to his feet. I will be honest, of your answers, my style is the most like Lucius. Lucius' eyes brightened. Mortimer continued, having people that are too ambitious is a problem, and it's best if they're weeded out. Under normal circumstances, this is a strength of a family, but when the world is in a burgeoning state of rapid growth, where heroes can be made overnight, it's much too great a risk to take. However, Lucius also performed the worst amongst the three of you, ranking just 5th on the leaderboard, and Astrid not only ranked 2nd, but her words have stirred something within me. In an ideal world, one where we were unafraid of failure, I would want to give Astrid's philosophy a chance. Mortimer paced for a moment before looking toward the three once again. Unfortunately, the battle between the three of you has yet to be decided, so I will give you a chance. The world will soon be in a state of turmoil, and you shouldn't grow complacent. It isn't just the Grimblades, Darkmanes and Ravenclaws that have an advantage, there will be many hidden dragons and crouching tigers. We have the advantage because we are the warriors, but they have the advantage of numbers. As you three know, in the past it was very much like this as well. The governments controlled the ether plane and our ancestors were able to carve out a path for us, eventually allowing us to rise to a stage where they could no longer ignore our strength and could only let us be. But as you've seen, over the years, the world records have been falling one after another. The 100-meter sprint is at 9.28, 12 separate athletes ran the marathon in under 2 hours at the last Olympics, the world record deadlift has reached 550 kilograms. The governments have taken a different approach from us, but their methods might very well work out for them in the long run and the carefully crafted chance we've been given could come crumbling down. Once this news descends, everyone might think that anarchy will come soon, but the governments will take this chance to display their competency, and soon there will be large numbers of people under their banners. However, they've been caught off guard by this matter much like we have. Their plans have yet to be fully entrenched and they've been caught with their pants down, so this is an opportunity. Since the trial was cut short, we will have to take your battle to a new stage. If you want to be granted the Bronze City Stele, it will be dependent on this next coming year. Of those in the family, there are 27 that took the trial against our best advice. Divide them amongst yourselves in a draft format. Astrid first, Malachi second, Lucius third. Your task from then on is simple. I will assign you each a random city. Whoever rips that city from the claws of the government first and firmly marks it as Grimblade territory, taking all its citizens under your wing, will be granted the Bronze City Stele. The three heir candidates clenched their fists hard, their eyes blazing with ambition. Ancestor, is it alright if we hold this draft after a period? Astrid asked. Mortimer thought for a moment and then nodded. You have 3 days. After that, you all will show me which of you deserves to lead the Grimblade family into this new world. You may go. After the three left, Mortimer stood in silence, looking out into the dense bamboo forest just outside his window. There were many secrets of the world that would be revealed very soon, so many that the matter of his living after all these years would be insignificant in the face of it all. The 7th summoning. Would they fail once again? End volume. 1 Chapter 137, Hike. 1150 GT's bonus. Silas jogged through the Brown family compound, his pace light and his breathing even. He had packed with the assumption that he would be staying here for a while, so he had most of what he needed. It turned out that he was right in the most unexpected way. It was still hard to wrap his mind around everything that had happened, but he thought himself to be a rational person. There was no need to ignore objective truth in favor of a reality that was no longer worth much in the grand scheme. The world was changing, and if you were smart, you would accept it. The cool wisp of fall air danced through the colored leaves. An array of reds, yellows, and oranges danced. Silas quite liked this sort of environment, and cardio had always been his guilty pleasure. Though, that was probably why the system had judged his strength to be weak overall. I hate you. A huffing breath of annoyance came from behind Silas, and he seemed to remember that he was on this little excursion with his little sister. The little munchkin had been attached at his hip for the past 2 days. She hated working out, and yet she had forced herself to come with him both yesterday and today. Silas found it adorable, though also quite unfortunate. Because she insisted on tagging along, he couldn't run at the speed he really wanted to go at. While his ether was suppressed, his physical stats were the same, as were his mental, will, and luck, for that matter. He had tested it already, and the outcome was both within his expectations and quite intoxicating. It made his experiences in the trial seem all the more real, and he was likewise all the more confident in his decision to go. If he was stuck in a world where he was suddenly surrounded by superhumans and a normal man, he would have felt suffocated. Maybe it's for the best, Silas thought to himself. If I ran at the speed I really wanted to, it would be very obvious to anyone that might be monitoring me what my true strength is at. If I want a chance to continue increasing my stats, I'll have to find a more covert method. Silas slowed his jog until his little sister caught up. Alara gave him a glare as he rubbed her little head, puffing out her cheeks as though she was a toddler rather than about to go into high school. All right, want a piggyback ride? Silas asked. She pouted her lips, clearly wanting to refuse. But in the end, her weak legs won out and she ended up on Silas' back. This isn't bad, Silas thought to himself. His sister was at most 100 pounds, and it wasn't nearly enough to strain his current self. But he thought that maybe if he found a way to add a substantial amount of weight to himself, he could see if he could eke out those extra stat points he was owed. Blood restriction should also be a good method. I've seen some studies on their usefulness, I'll have to try it out as well. Unfortunately, it seems that technology has stopped working as intended. Over the last few days, there had been some odd occurrences. For one, though his phone and laptop still worked, and the electric grid was fine, the internet was spotty at best. It seemed to only work at certain times of the day and it was much slower than it had been in the past, and even if just these last 2 days were taken into account, yesterday's internet was much faster than today's. Silas had considered the fact that maybe it was the Browns doing this, but he dismissed it after a while for no other reason than the unlikelihood. Logically speaking, the Browns would have definitely brought them over for a purpose. They needed them, and alienating them like this would do them no good in the long run. As I've thought in the past, there's only 2 groups of people who would respond to the Brown family's call. Either fools looking for a quick payday, or people who thought it through and felt that something was up. You might get such a tactic past the first group, but doing so for the latter would be near impossible. At the same time, the latter is the exact group they don't want to ostracize. Though I assume that soon, they'll start having us do something far more substantial than just laze around at our own pace. Silas continued to move, slowing into a brisk walk. If he jogged as normal now, it would be too obvious that his stats were on another level. Although he was certain that the Browns likely had a method of telling whether he entered or not, that didn't mean they had to know how strong he was. His current advantage was the fact he likely read as a level 0 on their list, even though his stats were beyond most. As for whether they could tell if he was an FFF plus or not, well, it was likely that they could. But in Silas' opinion, this wasn't a big deal either. He had recently come to understand that the grading system was on a curve and it was decided by relative strength. Being an FFF plus level 0 meant that amongst level 0s, he was excellent, but it didn't mean more than that. He might still very well be far weaker than a level 1. A stupid ranking system. I almost have a feeling that it's designed that way specifically to make new worlds like our own, fresh out from the summoning, overestimate themselves. Silas came to a stop as someone walked into his path. He was running along a trail in a hiking region. It was still on the Brown family compound, mostly because the estate was truly that large. It was rare for others to come, so the fact that someone had blocked him seemed to mean that they had come for him in specific. Chapter 138, Decent Enough. There were other active people like Silas, but there were less than 100 that had come back to the Browns family. With how large the compound was, the odds of a coincidence occurring were low at best, impossible at worst. It was a young woman wearing a tracksuit as well. The outfit was quite form-fitting, and for some reason, despite the chilly breeze, the zipper was undone to the point mounds of delicate brown skin were clearly visible. She looked up toward Silas in surprise, doing a double take at his height before smiling. "This is the second time," Silas suddenly said before the woman could speak. The young woman blinked in confusion. Her reaction was expected. Silas was speaking nonsense to her, she had all the right in the world to look at him like a crazy person. "Who sent you?" Silas asked. She blinked in surprise. "I." Silas shook his head. "Just tell them that they don't need to test me like this. It isn't necessary." He stepped by the woman, continuing up the hilly trek with large steps. "See, you're never going to get a girlfriend like that," Alara spoke into his ear. Silas almost wanted to laugh. "I can get a girlfriend just fine. Can you?" Alara asked doubtfully. "Why have I never seen you with one?" Silas didn't even know how to respond. He wouldn't introduce his family to random women, least of all his little sister. It was hard to judge a person's character even after you had known them for years, let alone a few short months. Who knew what they might do? That wasn't to say that Silas walked around thinking everyone to be some sort of mass murderer, but there were many levels below that, especially in the social media age. He didn't want to piss off the wrong woman, and have it end with his little sister getting harassed. He was fiercely protective of those he loved. "Maybe one day," Silas finally said. "Humph, if you're that desperate, I can introduce you to some nice girls. Remember Sophie, she really..." Silas reached back and covered his little sister's mouth, a cold sweat forming on his brow for the first time in this run. He did not want to listen to his little sister pitch to him why he should be considering a 13-year-old for a girlfriend. Alara wiggled her tongue into Silas' palm as revenge and the pair of siblings continued their hike up the mountain, leaving a stunned young woman behind. "Damn it, you're lucky you're wearing gloves. Ellipsis." He said that. The young woman stood before Astrid, half peeved and half respectful. Silas hadn't even exchanged a word with her before he said that. She wasn't really interested in Silas, aside from his looks. How could she be? She didn't even know him. But at the same time, to not even give her more than a glance. Astrid didn't seem to react much to this information at all. Silas wasn't the first to react like this. There were others that were more aggressive, and even quicker on the pickup as well. The reason Silas reacted the way that he did was because just yesterday, on his hike with his little sister, he had coincidentally met with another man. But this man, in both covert and overt ways, was practically grilling him about how he felt about the Browns family. It felt like the man was trying to goad him into saying something disparaging about the family in an attempt to get him into trouble, or at the very least, to tease out his real thoughts. For that man to appear yesterday, and for the woman to appear today, it wasn't a coincidence. Astrid sent the woman away and fell into her thoughts. His reaction wasn't the best. If he was the shrewd kind, he would have kept it to himself. But the true loose cannons reacted fiercely the first day. The man I sent was aggressive and hardly hid their intentions. But what is interesting is that today, he didn't even wait for the woman to speak first. Why is that? Is it related to something my brothers did? Maybe this isn't the second time he's run into such a matter, but rather the third, or fourth, or fifth. In that case, his grade might be even lower than it seems. I also need to factor in the fact that he was with his sister. Even if he was attracted to Melissa, it would take the worst of men to abandon his sister for the sake of some time with a woman he had only just met. Pulling out a sheet, Astrid began to score Silas, and in the end, she ranked him 7th on her draft sheet. Of the 27 individuals, she felt that there were likely 6 she should pick above Silas. But the trouble was, next, she pulled out Silas' file. He's my cousin, at least in name, there shouldn't be much blood relation if any at all. His grandfather was a true Grimblade until he married out. A tenured professor at Viridian at such a young age. But the credentials of the other 6 are even better than this. His resume isn't very diverse and his doctorate was completed in an inconsequential field. Astrid tapped her pen on the desk, clicking and unclicking it out of habit. She wished that she could meet him in person, but this would be against the rules. It seemed she would just have to stick with her current evaluation. Silas returned to his family's home with his sister on his back. As he passed by, he waved politely to the family that lived near them. His parents had been bored out of their minds, so they had begun to make friends with their surrounding neighbors, and that had eventually roped him into the mess. They obviously all shared the Brown family name, though that was now Grimblade. They seemed like decent enough people. Chapter 139, Draft. Silas dropped his sister down and the two went their separate ways to clean themselves up. There were more than enough bathrooms in the house and Silas could already smell breakfast in the air, but his mind was on other things. The internet is going down, and I wouldn't be surprised if soon all electronic devices stopped working. In that case, my goal to use a supercomputer to analyze the Basilisk King's genome might be a pipe dream. Is the only solution to improve my wisdom to the point I can analyze it myself. Silas shook his head. No, he didn't have so much time to waste. He would have to find a way to get off the Brown family compound before technology became completely useless. Soon came the third day. The day of the draft. Silas stood in a row with several other people. He could feel just from the cadence of their breathing that these individuals weren't normal. It wasn't just the rhythm, but the sheer length of time between their breaths. Some of them only seemed to take in a breath every few seconds, some of them only seemed to breathe twice or thrice a minute. He couldn't help but wonder if they noticed that they were doing this or not. Unlike Silas, who only spent over a week in the trial, they had all experienced months. This was their new normal, and they probably hadn't registered that they weren't acting as others did any longer. The room they all stood in was quite simple and unadorned. There were training mats that lined the floors and even the walls. It looked like a place for combat and sparring, though there was no other equipment aside from this. Before them, there was a group of people. Or, rather, 3. Each one was headed by one of the 3 candidates for City Lord of the Bronze Stele, Astrid Grimblade, Malachi Grimblade, and Lucius Grimblade. Behind Astrid in particular, Silas spotted Melissa, the woman that had stopped him just yesterday. He also spotted the man who had questioned him as though he was some sort of psychotic consoriginal theorist. He noticed that some were surprised by their presences, but most weren't. Last I checked, all 3 were level 9s, but Astrid was ranked 1st, Malachi 2nd, and Lucius 3rd. I wonder how large the gap between them is. Is the ranking based on strength? Or purely how close to level 10 they were? And if it's just based on distance to level 10, theoretically the stronger their foundations, the more pure ether you would need to level. It was easy to doubt the rankings at this point. Everything Silas learned about this world made him second-guess everything else. It was as though they wanted him to take it all in with a grain of salt. Malachi stepped forward. The first time they were all addressed, it was Astrid. It seemed that he had drawn the winning lot this time around. We've called you all forward today because you're the elites that managed to enter and survive the trial, coming out and becoming pillars of the family. You were all informed earlier that my brother, sister, and myself are in competition for City Lord. Unfortunately, that was cut short, so we will enter a new challenge. This is not all bad, as it gives us a different set of opportunities. Today, we'll be drafting you all into our teams. Astrid will go first, I will go second, and Lucius will go third. We do not know much about you all, so we can only base it on what we've seen from your trial performance, your levels, and some other general information about your lives. So if you feel that you've been misevaluated, I can only say to prove us wrong in the future. We are all family here. Regardless of which of the 3 of us wins, we'll all have just one goal in the future, and that'll be to support one another and the rise of the Grimblade family. Malachi didn't say much more, taking a step back and allowing Astrid to come forward. Before all of this, Astrid had felt that going first was a blessing. But over the last 3 days, she realized just how much pressure there was. While she had the most freedom to pick, that came with the greatest room for mistakes. But this wasn't the time to look indecisive. She had to display a strong front. Alexander. The moment she stepped forward, the name rolled off her tongue with great ease. A man stepped forward. He had a sharp, military cut and a jaw sharper than a blade. Astrid picked him less for his performance in the trial, and more because of his background. The reality was that anyone could get unlucky in the trial, especially when they wouldn't have as much information and resources on hand as Astrid and the others. Just survival alone was impressive enough. The numbers hadn't been released yet, but there was no doubt a worse than 90% mortality rate for those that entered the trial. If previous patterns remained true, about half of the people on Earth should have accepted entry. That meant, overnight, nearly half of Earth's population had vanished. So the real reason Astrid had picked Alexander was because his background was excellent. He was a special force member, handpicked out of military college to join the elite NIA, and evaluated to have an IQ of 147. He was cool under pressure, had experience in subterfuge and espionage, and more importantly than that, he had an inside look into the current state of the government. There was no doubt that he was a high-risk, high-reward sort of choice. He was exactly the kind of man that Lucius might have wanted to kill just to avoid the trouble. Right now, the government were their enemy, but to the common people, they were a force of good, while to a military man like Alexander, this was almost certainly so. Chapter 140, Draft 2. 1250 GT's bonus. However, if this was truly the case, why did he return to the call of the Browns? This was what Astrid was betting on. Alexander walked to Astrid's side and took his place. He seemed neither pleased nor disappointed by what had just happened. His baseline remained the same and his alertness didn't fade in the slightest. Lucius stepped forward next. Isabella. A woman with her hair done up in a high bun and particularly large, brown eyes stepped forward. Her eyes made her look far more youthful than she was, when in reality she should have been in her 40s. She was a renowned surgeon and had become a laureate in medicine for her work in advancing the field of surgical enhancements, specifically in the field of athletic performance. She had managed to take a foundation of CRISPR treatments for blood-borne diseases like sickle cell anemia and turned them toward not just fixing ailments but creating superhumans as well. Of course, it wasn't so exaggerated, and most of her methods were banned in official competition, but she had opened up much discussion in philosophy fields for what should be allowed in terms of innovation, and what shouldn't be. Nathan. Lucius spoke up right afterward, almost as though he was scared someone else would speak up before him. Nathan Brown was the only other billionaire in the group aside from the three of them. However, he was extraordinarily unique because he wasn't the majority owner in any one of his businesses. Instead, he was known as an eccentric that liked to create and then abandon projects, keeping a small sliver of their profit. But even so, having entered his 50s, he had successfully formed 3 companies with billion-dollar evaluations and almost 4 dozen others that were into the 9 figures. All of his success was supposedly based off of his self-created AI, one that he modified based on the business and research of the market. He was a business genius few could compare to. Like that, it was Astrid's choice once more, and she was wholly surprised. Because her number 2 was still there. On her list, Alexander was first, Nathan was third, and Isabella was fourth. As for her second, it was Elena. Elena Brown was the second and final laureate of the batch, a brilliant geneticist. It could be said that, at least in part, Isabella wouldn't even exist without Elena. She was the oldest of them all, approaching her 60s. She would have been the last person any one of them expected to enter the trial, but she had come out stronger on the other side. In fact, she had managed to become a level 5 and was an FFF plus level threat on top of that. Astrid almost felt that it was unbelievable she wasn't chosen, but when she thought about it, she understood. This woman was maybe more dangerous than even Alexander. Any 60-year-old willing to take such a risk was on another level entirely. She wasn't much more than 10 or so years younger than Scylla's own grandfather. In addition, she was a geneticist. Given that genes built the foundation of this world, who was to say whether she could capitalize on this and surpass them all? The mental fortitude needed to do what she had done made the risk factor associated with her that much higher. This was where the difference in philosophies between herself and her brothers shone through. However, even so, Astrid took her without hesitation. As she said, it was the job of a leader to wield these double-edged swords. If she couldn't make them shine through, what was the point? Lucius and Malachi both reacted with sharp gazes, but neither said a word. Sophia. Malachi made his pick, and though it wasn't nearly as awe-inspiring as the first four, it was a solid pick nonetheless. Sophia Brown was an environmental scientist focused on renewable resources. There was a small chance that she could leverage this as they moved from an era of fossil fuels to ether, but this was only a secondary reason for Malachi. More importantly than this, Sophia was an Olympian. In fact, she was a silver medalist in the 5K. Compared to others, her foundational genes should be exceptional, and she had a lot of room to grow. Aside from these first four, most of the coming choices would be based on these more physical evaluations as well. Finally, it was Lucius' turn once again. For the first time, an immediate choice wasn't made. Lucius stood there for a long while, looking them all in the eyes one by one. Some looked away beneath his pressure, others continued to meet his gaze, and then there were some that didn't look at him at all. Silas fell into this category, his breathing even. He seemed focused on keeping his breathing normal, taking a breath every 1 to 2 seconds. Silas. The echo of his name caused Silas to look up and meet Lucius' gaze for the first time. He nodded faintly, then walked toward the man, taking up a spot beside Nathan. The billionaire gave him a smile and Silas nodded in acknowledgement. Nathan seemed to have a perpetual twinkle in his eyes, as though he was always searching for the next thing to tinker with. The rest of the draft went by swiftly. Unsurprisingly, the further along they went, the less impressive they became. But overall, the standard didn't fall too far. Just by virtue of being able to make it here, these people were decently well off without a doubt. Soon, everyone was allocated. Come with me, Lucius spoke to his 9 choices, taking them out of the room and toward his personal living quarters. The main Grimblade family lived in the core of the compound and Lucius had one of the many sectioned off courtyards within. He gathered everyone on his large, 20-person dining table and called his chefs in to prepare a large meal.